I want to take you into a moment that every nurse and nursing student has either lived or is going to live. You are in a patient room. Something is wrong. Maybe the monitor alarms. Maybe the patient's color changes. Maybe you walk in for a routine assessment and something just does not look right. And your gut drops before your brain has finished processing what your eyes are seeing. And then it happens. You freeze. Not for a long time. Maybe 2 seconds, maybe 5. But in those seconds, your brain, the same brain that reviewed this patient's chart, that studied this condition, that watched the simulation videos, that passed the exam on this exact clinical scenario, goes completely silent. You know you are supposed to do something. You know you have been trained for this, and you cannot access any of it. And then the moment breaks. You move, you call for help, you do something, and afterward, when your hands have finally stopped shaking, you sit somewhere quiet and think, what was that? Why did I freeze? I knew what to do. Why couldn't I do it? I have been there, and I have watched hundreds of nursing students go through exactly that experience and walk away believing the wrong thing about themselves. They think they froze because they didn't know enough, because they weren't ready, because they're not cut out for this. None of that is true. You froze because you are human, because your brain is running ancient hardware in a more modern clinical environment. Because the same neurological system that kept your ancestors alive on the savannah is the one you are taking into the ICU. And it does not know the difference between a lion and a crashing patient. It just knows threat. And threat triggers a cascade that temporarily takes your thinking brain offline. That is not a character flaw. That is a mechanism. And mechanisms can be understood. And once they're understood, they can be worked with. Today, we are going inside that freeze. The neuroscience of what actually happens in your brain when you face a code, a crisis, an acute deterioration, a preceptor question you can't answer under pressure. And more importantly, we are going to talk about what the research actually shows about building the kind of neural architecture that makes you functional, not frozen when it counts. Aristotle said that to understand a thing, you must know its cause. The cause of the freeze is in your brain, and understanding it is the first step to owning it. Welcome to Think Like a Provider. Let's get into it. I'm Genoa Whitley, nurse practitioner, clinical educator, and creator of Think Like a Provider, the clinical reasoning system that teaches nurses and nursing students to master body systems through pathophysiology and evidence-based frameworks. We don't memorize here. We understand. If you're new, every episode, we break down the mechanisms behind clinical reasoning, neuroscience, and what it actually takes to perform at your best, so you walk away thinking and acting like the provider you are meant to be. And if you want to go deeper than a podcast can take you, we have clinical reasoning tools, ebooks, and a growing Facebook community where we break this down together every single day. And if you are ready for the full Academy experience, the Think Like a Provider Academy waitlist is open now. All the links are in the show notes. The greatest clinicians in history reasoned their way to the answer. So will you. Let's get into it. This is our neuroscience episode for the month. And I want to be really clear about what that means in the Think Like a Provider context. This is not a psychology episode about managing anxiety. This is a neuroscience episode about a specific mechanism. What happens inside your brain under acute stress, and how understanding that mechanism changes how you train, how you perform, and how you recover from the moments that shake you. Mechanism first, always. What actually happens when you freeze? Let's start with the brain. You have, broadly speaking, two brain systems that are relevant to this conversation. You have your prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain sitting right behind your forehead. And you have your amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe on both sides. These two structures have a relationship that is fundamental to everything we are talking about today. The prefrontal cortex is your thinking brain, executive function, working memory, complex decision-making, clinical reasoning, all of that lives here. When you are reasoning through a differential, prioritizing a patient, reading a clinical picture and generating a response, that is your prefrontal cortex doing its job. This is the part of your brain that makes you a clinician. The amygdala is your threat detection system. Its job evolutionarily is to scan the environment for danger and generate a rapid response before your thinking brain has time to deliberate. The amygdala does not wait for you to reason through a situation. It acts on pattern recognition. And the pattern it is looking for is threat. Under normal conditions, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala have a working relationship. The amygdala flags potential threats. The prefrontal cortex evaluates them, contextualizes them, and modulates the response. You feel the alarm, but you can also think through it. Under acute stress, that relationship breaks down. Here is the mechanism. When you encounter a perceived threat, the code alarm, the deteriorating patient, the preceptor who just stopped you and asked a question you did not expect, your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis activates. Cortisol and catecholamines flood your system. Your sympathetic nervous system fires. And here is the critical part. The functional connectivity between your prefrontal cortex and your amygdala changes. Research published in Molecular Psychiatry in 2023 showed this directly. Acute stress alters the connectivity within the corticolimbic network, specifically the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The amygdala becomes hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex becomes functionally suppressed. What does that mean in clinical terms? It means the thinking brain goes offline first and the threat response brain takes over. Your amygdala is running the show, and the amygdala's response options are limited: fight, flight, or freeze. Freeze is actually the most underappreciated of the three. It is not a failure to respond. It is an evolutionarily ancient protective response to overwhelming threat. When the threat is too large or too fast to fight or flee from, the nervous system defaults to immobility. It is the opossum playing dead. It is the prey animal that goes still when the predator is already on top of it. It is, in clinical terms, the nursing student standing at the bedside of a crashing patient, knowing something needs to happen and being unable to initiate it. The freeze response is not weakness. It is biology. And it is happening because your amygdala has assessed the situation as a threat beyond your current capacity to manage, which in clinical terms means your brain does not yet have enough procedural confidence in this scenario to activate your prefrontal cortex instead of defaulting to the freeze. That last sentence is the most important thing I'm going to say in this episode. Your brain does not yet have enough procedural confidence. That is the operative phrase. Because procedural confidence is buildable, and understanding how to build it is exactly what the rest of this episode is about. The memory system that saves you. To understand how to stop freezing, you need to understand the difference between two types of memory: declarative memory and procedural memory, because most nursing education builds declarative memory, and what you need to perform under pressure is procedural memory. Declarative memory is explicit. It is the kind of memory that lets you recall facts, concepts, and information consciously. When you study ACLS algorithms, review the steps of a code blue response, read about airway management. All of that is building declarative memory. It is the knowledge you can describe, explain, and recite. Procedural memory is implicit. It is the kind of memory that encodes motor sequences and automatic behavioral patterns through repetition. When a pianist plays a piece without consciously thinking about each note, that is procedural memory. When a surgeon reaches for an instrument without looking at the tray, that is procedural memory. When a nurse who has run 30 codes reaches for the crash cart without any deliberate thought process, that is procedural memory. Here is the critical difference. Declarative memory is accessible when your prefrontal cortex is online. Procedural memory is accessible even when your prefrontal cortex is offline, even when the amygdala has taken over, even when you are flooded with cortisol and your thinking brain is functionally suppressed. Your implicit procedural memory still fires because it is stored in your basal ganglia and cerebellum, structures that are not as vulnerable to acute stress suppression as the prefrontal cortex. This is why experienced clinicians do not freeze in codes. It is not because they feel less stressed. Research consistently shows that experienced clinicians still have elevated cortisol and sympathetic activation during acute crises. They freeze less, not because the stress response is smaller, but because they have procedural memory that runs independently of the thinking brain that stress suppresses. And here is the part that most nursing education completely misses. Declarative memory does not automatically become procedural memory. Reading the ACLS algorithm builds declarative memory. Practicing the ACLS algorithm in a simulation, under realistic conditions, with realistic stressors, repeatedly, builds procedural memory. The two are stored differently. The two require different types of learning experiences to encode. And only one of them is available to you when your amygdala is running the show. This is the gap between knowing what to do and doing it under pressure. It is not a knowledge gap. It is a memory encoding gap. And the solution is not more studying, the solution is more practicing. Specifically, more deliberate practice under conditions that approximate the stress of real clinical situations. The research supports this directly. A systematic review published in the Ulster Medical Journal in 2024, examining stress, learning, and performance in healthcare simulation, found that simulation-based training significantly improves performance under stress, specifically by building procedural competencies that remain accessible when cognitive load is highest. And a longitudinal study published in Nursing Reports in 2025 showed that greater simulation experience was associated with significantly lower cortisol levels, lower heart rate, and lower diastolic blood pressure during clinical performance evaluation. Not because simulation made the students feel less nervous, but because the repetition had built procedural memory that the nervous system could access even under the stress response. More practice, more simulation, more deliberate repetition. That is the mechanism of becoming the nurse who does not freeze. Why studying more doesn't fix it. I want to stay on this for a moment because it runs directly counter to how most nursing students respond to the freeze experience. You freeze in clinical, you feel humiliated and shaken. You go home and you study harder. You review every algorithm, reread every procedure, quiz yourself on every drug. You build more declarative memory. And then the next high-stakes moment comes, and you freeze again, and now you feel even worse because you studied and it still happened. This is the most common and most demoralizing cycle I see nursing students fall into. And it is happening because they are applying the wrong intervention to the right problem. The problem is not a knowledge deficit. The problem is a procedural memory deficit. And no amount of declarative memory building fills a procedural memory gap. Think about it this way. You can read every book ever written about riding a bicycle. You can memorize the physics of balance, the mechanics of the chain drive, the biomechanics of pedaling. You can pass a written test on bicycle riding with a perfect score. And then someone puts you on a bicycle and you fall. Not because you lack knowledge, because the knowledge is in your prefrontal cortex and bicycle riding lives in your cerebellum and your basal ganglia. And those structures only learn by doing. Clinical performance under stress is the same. The steps of a code response that you've memorized are sitting in your prefrontal cortex. But under code conditions, your prefrontal cortex is being suppressed by the stress cascade. The knowledge is in there. You just cannot access it. You need those same steps encoded somewhere else, in your procedural memory, through repetition and practice, so that when the cortisol floods your system and the amygdala takes over, your body already knows what to do next. This is also why simulation feels uncomfortable in a way that studying doesn't. Simulation activates the stress response in a way that reading doesn't. Your heart rate goes up, your palms sweat. You feel the pressure of being watched and evaluated. That discomfort is not a design flaw in simulation, it is the mechanism. Mild to moderate stress during skill practice is actually beneficial for procedural memory encoding because it activates the same neurological state the skill needs to be accessible in. A 2024 systematic review on simulation and stress in healthcare confirmed exactly this. The moderate stress of simulation creates more durable procedural learning than low stress practice. So if you're in a program with high fidelity simulation, use it. Use it like it's real. Do not go through the motions of the scenario. Do it like there is a real patient on that table. Let yourself feel the discomfort. That discomfort is the training stimulus. It is what separates performed competence from demonstrated competence under pressure. And if your program's simulation is limited, you create your own. You practice procedures until they are automatic. You walk through code scenarios in your head, out loud, in real time. You do deliberate practice in the skills lab until your hands know what to do before your brain has finished deciding. You are building the memory system that will save you when the thinking system goes offline. What to do in the moment. Now let's talk about the freeze itself, because no matter how much you train, you will at some point still encounter a moment where you feel that cortisol spike and that millisecond of paralysis. And when that happens, you need tools that work at the neurological level to re-engage your prefrontal cortex quickly. Here is what the neuroscience shows. The fastest evidence-based intervention to restore prefrontal cortex function during acute stress is controlled breathing, specifically extended exhalation. Your exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system through the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the primary downregulation pathway of the stress response. When you exhale slowly, you are literally signaling your nervous system to reduce sympathetic activation. And as sympathetic activation decreases, the amygdala becomes less hyperactive and prefrontal cortex function begins to return. You do not need to do 4 rounds of box breathing in the middle of a code. You need 1 slow exhale, 1 intentional extended exhale before your first action. It takes less than 3 seconds. And the mechanism is real. It is not a mindfulness platitude. It is vagal nerve stimulation initiated by voluntary respiratory control. The second tool is the cognitive anchor, a specific practiced phrase or cue that you have preloaded to activate your procedural memory sequence when the thinking brain is struggling. First responders train this explicitly. Pilots train this. Surgeons train this. Airway, breathing, circulation is a cognitive anchor. Start the compressions is a cognitive anchor, a short, specific, action-initiating phrase that bypasses the deliberation process and activates the trained sequence. The reason this works neurologically is that the anchor itself can be encoded into procedural memory through repetition. When you practice the same phrase before the same action hundreds of times in training, the phrase eventually triggers the action automatically, without requiring prefrontal deliberation. You hear start compressions, and your hands move before your brain has fully caught up. Third, and this is the one most people overlook, your physical position matters. Research on embodied cognition shows that upright, expansive posture activates cortisol buffering mechanisms and reduces the intensity of the freeze response. Not power pose pseudoscience, but the practical reality that a collapsed, contracted physical position reinforces the freeze, and an upright, action-oriented position facilitates breaking out of it. Stand up, orient toward the patient, move to the bedside. Even moving your feet is often enough to break the freeze because movement itself reactivates the motor system and begins the procedural sequence. 1 breath, 1 anchor phrase, move your feet. That is the in-the-moment protocol, not complex, not time-consuming, neurologically grounded. Building the brain that doesn't freeze. Let me bring this back to the long game because the in-the-moment tools are necessary but not sufficient. The real work is building a brain that is less vulnerable to the freeze in the first place. The research on this is consistent and can be summarized in one principle. Deliberate practice under realistic conditions, repeated over time, builds procedural competency that is stress resistant. What does that actually look like for a nursing student? It means you do not just practice skills until you can do them correctly. You practice them until you cannot do them incorrectly. That is the distinction between beginning competence and procedural automaticity. Correct once is declarative memory. Correct automatically, without conscious direction, under pressure. That is procedural memory. It means you seek out simulation even when it is uncomfortable, especially when it is uncomfortable. The studies are clear. The stress of simulation is the mechanism of learning. Avoiding the discomfort of simulation is avoiding the training stimulus. It means you debrief every high-stakes experience, not to beat yourself up about what went wrong, but to extract the clinical data from it. What was the trigger? Where did the thinking stop? What did your body do first? What broke the freeze? That debriefing process is metacognitive. It is your thinking brain analyzing the experience of your stress response brain. And it is one of the most powerful tools for building clinical self-awareness and accelerating competency development. It means you take care of the brain that has to perform under pressure. Everything we talked about in episode 8, nutrition, glucose, hydration, those are not separate from this conversation. A brain running on inadequate glucose and elevated baseline cortisol from chronic stress is a brain with a shorter distance to the freeze threshold. Your physiological state before you walk onto the clinical floor is part of your performance preparation, and it means you give yourself the time this actually takes. The transition from I freeze under pressure to I am functional under pressure is not a weekend. It is not a semester. It is the cumulative product of hundreds of hours of deliberate practice, real clinical exposure, and honest self-assessment. Every code you see, even from the doorway, every simulation you run, even when it goes badly, every moment of freeze you recover from, all of it is data. All of it is building the neural architecture that will eventually look like composure, but is actually something far more interesting and more earned than that. It is procedural memory. It is a trained brain, and it is completely within your reach. Here is where I want to leave you. The freeze is not evidence of incompetence. It is evidence of human neurobiology operating exactly as it was designed to operate. Protecting you from a threat the way it has protected every human nervous system for tens of thousands of years. The amygdala does not know you are in a hospital. It just knows threat, and its response to threat is ancient, fast, and powerful. But here is what Aristotle understood that most people miss. The way to change a behavior is not to suppress the mechanism producing it. It is to understand the mechanism well enough to build an alternative. The mechanism of the freeze is amygdala hyperactivation and prefrontal cortex suppression. The alternative is procedural memory, a parallel system stored differently, accessible under the exact conditions where the thinking brain is offline. You build that alternative by practicing deliberately, under realistic stress, until the clinical sequence lives somewhere the amygdala cannot touch. And in the moments before that architecture is fully built, you use the breath, the anchor, and your feet to buy your prefrontal cortex the seconds it needs to come back online. You are not going to be perfect in every high-stakes moment. Neither is anyone else. What you are doing every time you practice, every time you simulate, every time you show up to clinical and push through the discomfort, is building the brain of the clinician you are becoming. That is not metaphor. That is neuroscience. For this week's homework, pick one clinical skill or emergency scenario that you know makes you anxious. Could be a code. Could be starting an IV under pressure. Could be an aggressive ACLS algorithm, and practice it. Not to review it, not to read about it. Practice it out loud in sequence as if it were happening. Do it 3 times in a row without stopping. You are not reviewing information. You are encoding procedural memory. There is a meaningful difference. And the difference shows up when it matters most. If you want to go deeper, if you want to train your clinical reasoning with the same mechanism-based approach we apply to everything in this community, the links are in the show notes. Our clinical reasoning tools, ebooks, and Facebook community are there waiting for you. And if you are ready for the full Academy experience, get on the wait list for the Think Like a Provider Academy. We are building something serious for the nurse who wants to understand deeply, not just pass quickly. You were built for this. Your brain just needs the right kind of training to prove it. See you next week.